Triton 1 to Eagle Eye. Do you have eyes on the target? Respond. The voice of Lieutenant Marcus Thorne hissed through the radio static, nearly drowned out by the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing off the cliffs. They are pushing our eastern flank. We cannot hold for more than 5 minutes. Silence. The only reply was the sound of wind whistling over the mountain peaks and her own steady, slow breathing. Eagle Eye answer. Damn it, another voice cut in frantic. Those bastards are about to overrun us. Target locked. A woman's voice replied, unnervingly calm amidst the firestorm. Crosswind 7 meters per second. Hold 1.4 mils left. Distance 1,420 meters. Thorne practically yelled into his radio. Impossible, that is an impossible shot, Sergeant. The risk is too high. I order you to fall back to a safer position. There was no reply. Only a long, heavy silence. The entire Triton squad held its breath, listening to the pounding of their own hearts and the clink of their gear. They could smell the cordite, the dust, and their own fear. Then a single sound came over the comms channel. Not the boom of a rifle, but the sound of a metal casing being ejected, hitting rock dry and decisive. A single tink in the valley of death. The air in the long, prefabricated barracks of Forward Operating Base Vigil was thick with the scent of sand sweat and cheap coffee. It was a chaotic symphony of life at the edge of the world. Men from a dozen nations shouted over the rattle of a card game, the heavy bass of some distant tinny music, and the constant low hum of the generators that kept the lights on and the war running. In the midst of this noise, Sergeant Elena Rostova was an island of absolute silence. She sat on her cot, a simple metal frame with a thin mattress, a pool of focused light from a single headlamp cutting through the gloom. Spread before her on a clean olive-drab gun mat was her M2010 enhanced sniper rifle disassembled into its core components. To anyone else, it was a collection of precisely machined steel and polymer. To Elena, it was an extension of her own will, and it demanded a ritualistic reverence. Her movements were economical, deliberate, and utterly devoid of haste. A small, stiff-bristled brush worked its way down the rifling of the barrel, its scratching sound lost in the larger cacophony of the barracks. Her fingers, lean and calloused, moved with the familiarity of a surgeon wiping away microscopic grains of dust from the bolt assembly. She did not hear the laughter from the card table or the argument over a shared laptop. Her world had shrunk to the trigger group in her hands, to the faint metallic scent of CLP lubricant, and to the weight of each component as she inspected it for any sign of wear, any hint of imperfection. This process was her sanctuary. It was a place where variables could be controlled, where order could be imposed on a universe defined by chaos. It was here in the meticulous care of her rifle that she quieted the ghosts. The ghost of a past mission, of a wind call she had hesitated on, of a fraction of a second that had unraveled into consequence. She never spoke of it. No one in Triton Squad knew. They only knew her as the quiet Russian sniper who kept to herself, the woman who could hold a position for 72 hours without complaint, and whose accuracy on the range was the stuff of quiet legend and occasional grudging disbelief. Lieutenant Marcus Thorne, the leader of Triton's squad, approached her corner of the barracks. He was a good officer, respected by his men, a man who led from the front. But even he seemed to hesitate before entering the small bubble of concentration that surrounded Elena. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over her work. Rostova, he said, his voice a low baritone that still felt like an intrusion. She did not look up immediately. She finished seating the firing pin back into the bolt, the click of the metal a soft, final punctuation. Only then did she raise her eyes. They were a pale, clear gray, and they held his gaze without challenge but also without invitation. "Lieutenant," she acknowledged. Her voice was as controlled as her hands. "Ready for tomorrow?" he asked. It was not a question about her equipment. He knew better than to question her readiness on that front. It was a deeper question, one that hovered in the space between them. A question of her place in the team of the walls she kept built so high. Elena picked up the main body of the rifle, her hands moving to reattach the bolt assembly. The metallic slide and lock was a smooth, satisfying sound. It was the sound of a problem being solved, of a tool being made whole. "I'm always ready, sir," she said. Thorne nodded slowly. He saw the rifle now almost fully reassembled. He saw the unwavering focus in her eyes. He still felt that small, unnameable gap between her and the rest of the team, but he trusted the steel in her hands and the steel in her spine. Good. Briefing in 10. Overwatch mission should be simple. He turned and walked away. Elena watched him go before her gaze returned to her rifle. Simple. There was no such thing as a simple mission. There were only variables and the silence of steel waiting to answer them. The briefing room was cold, a stark contrast to the simmering heat outside. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile bluish glow on the faces of the 10 soldiers of Triton Squad. They filled the small space with a relaxed, confident energy, their easy banter and laughter echoing off the bare plywood walls. They had seen dozens of rooms like this, heard dozens of briefings for missions that were supposed to be simple. Lieutenant Thorne stood at the head of the room, a laser pointer in his hand, casting a sharp red dot on a large satellite image projected onto the wall. The image showed a series of rugged, rust-colored mountains bisected by a narrow pass. "All right, settle down," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chatter. The room fell silent. Operation Sentinel Pass. High-altitude overwatch and route reconnaissance. Intel suggests minimal enemy activity. The objective is to establish a covert observation post overlooking the Tarmac Valley Road here. The red dot circled a winding stretch of pavement. "We need to confirm it is clear for a major supply convoy moving through in 48 hours. Simple observation. We go in, we watch, we go home. Rules of engagement are strict. We are not to engage unless fired upon." A few of the men nodded, their expressions bordering on bored. A milk run, they called it. Elena sat slightly apart from the others, her back straight, her hands resting on her knees. She was not listening to the men. She was reading the mountain. Her eyes traced the contours of the land on the screen, absorbing the topography, the potential lines of sight, the shadows that would lengthen as the sun moved across the sky. She saw not just a pass, but a complex, tactical problem full of deadly possibilities. While Thorne continued detailing insertion points and communication protocols, Elena's gaze remained fixed on the satellite photo. Her eyes narrowed. There on the eastern ridge, almost lost in a jumble of rocks and scrub, was a faint thread-like line. It was not a natural feature. It was a path worn into the earth by repeated passage, a path that was absent from the official topographical data overlaid on the image. It branched off from a goat trail and led directly to a high point that offered a commanding view of the very same pass Triton was meant to secure. Her pulse quickened slightly. It could be nothing. An old shepherd's trail. But it was a variable and unknown quantity, and unknowns were what got people killed. The ghost of her past whispered a cold warning in her ear. Doubt is a luxury. Observation is a duty. Something to add. Sergeant Rostova Thorne's voice cut into her thoughts. He had noticed her intense focus on the screen. The other men turned to look at her, a few with expressions of mild curiosity, others with impatience. Elena stood. She walked to the screen, her movements measured. She did not use the laser pointer. She raised her hand and pointed a single steady finger at the anomaly. "Sir." This trail here. It is not on the map. A sergeant named Griggs squinted. Looks like a washout, Lieutenant. A trick of the light. No. Elena said, her voice quiet but firm, carrying an authority that made them listen. The edges are too defined. The discoloration is consistent with foot traffic. It leads to a potential overwatch position superior to our own proposed location. The room was silent for a beat. Thorne walked closer to the screen, studying the spot she indicated. He saw what she meant. It was subtle, something 99% of people would have missed. He was impressed, but he was also a man who trusted his intelligence reports. Intel reports no established enemy presence in this sector. Sergeant, he said, his tone professional but with a finality to it. I appreciate the vigilance. We will take it under advisement. You will keep a particular eye on that ridge from your position. He turned back to the rest of the squad. All right, gear check in 30. Wheels up at 0400. The men began to file out, the confident chatter resuming. Elena remained for a moment, looking at the faint line on the screen. Thorne had heard her, but he had not listened. She had done her duty and voiced the concern. Now all she could do was prepare for a mission that she felt deep in her gut was anything but simple. The world before 0400 was a realm of ghosts. The moon was a sliver offering little light, and the landscape was rendered in the ghostly greens and blacks of their night vision goggles. The air was shockingly cold, a dry, biting chill that seeped through their combat uniforms and settled deep in the bone. It smelled of dust and ancient stone. Triton squad moved through this spectral world, like wraiths, their only communication, a series of precise, practiced hand signals. The only sound was the soft crunch of their boots on the gravelly earth and the whisper of the wind funneling down from the high passes. They reached the base of the ridge an hour before sunrise. Here their paths diverged. Lieutenant Thorne gave a single sharp nod to Elena. It was the only farewell. She nodded back, then melted away from the group, her silhouette a lone shadow against the slightly less black shape of the mountain. The main body of Triton squad would continue along the base of the ridge to their designated position near the pass. Elena's journey was vertical. Her ascent was slow and methodical. The heavy pack containing her rifle ammunition, optics, and survival gear for 72 hours felt like an anchor trying to pull her back down the slope. Every step was a calculated decision, every handhold tested before she committed her weight. The world through her NVGs flattened the terrain, making it difficult to judge depth and steepness. She relied on feel, on the subtle shift of scree under her boot, on the rough texture of the rock against her gloved hands. She was about halfway to her chosen position when it happened. Reaching for a new handhold, her fingers closed on a section of rock that looked solid, but was anything but. It crumbled under her grip. For a terrifying half-second, her balance was gone. Her boot scraped loudly against the rock face as she fought for purchase, sending a small cascade of pebbles clattering down into the darkness below. The sound was a gunshot in the profound silence. Instantly, she froze, pressing her body flat against the cold stone, her heart hammering against her ribs. Below her, she knew the rest of Triton's squad would have frozen too, every man a statue listening. The sound had been loud enough to carry, loud enough to alert anyone who might be listening. In that moment of imbalance, the cold dread of her past failure washed over her, a sickening lurch in her stomach, the phantom feeling of a world tilting off its axis of control, being lost. She held her breath, counting the seconds, straining her ears against the wind. Nothing. No shouts. No returning sounds. Only the mournful sigh of the wind. After a full minute that felt like an eternity, she allowed herself a slow, controlled exhale. The immediate danger had passed, but the adrenaline left a tremor in her hands. She pushed the memory away, locking it back in its cage, and resumed her climb with even greater care. When she finally reached the small, natural rock formation that would serve as her nest, the first hints of dawn were painting the eastern horizon in pale shades of violet and gray. She shrugged off her pack and began to set up her position with the quiet efficiency of long practice. She unrolled her camouflage netting, arranging it to break up her outline. Then she assembled her rifle, the clicks of the metal components sounding unnervously loud to her own ears. As she settled behind the scope, the vast, empty expanse of the tarmac valley began to emerge from the receding darkness. She was in position. The long watch had begun. As the sun climbed, it bled the color from the sky and baked the rocks around Elena until they radiated a palpable heat. The world below shimmered. The air itself became a visible, tangible thing, a wavy, distorting lens that made the simple act of observation an exercise in extreme patience. This was the sniper's battle with the environment, a fight against physics and light that was as challenging as any human enemy. Elena was a statue carved from the rock. Hours passed. She did not move save for the slow, sweeping motion of her M151 spotting scope as she methodically quartered the valley. Beside her, her data book lay open. On a fresh page, she had sketched a detailed panorama of her sector, a range card of her world. Every significant rock formation, every deep wash, every potential piece of cover was noted, the distance to it precisely calculated and written down. It was a map of death drawn with an artist's precision. Her focus was absolute. She saw the world in millimeters through the powerful optics of her Leupold scope. She noted the direction the sparse, hardy bushes bent in the wind, the patterns of dust kicked up by a passing breeze. Her body was a finely tuned instrument. The taste of salt on her lips from her own sweat, the steady pressure of the rifle butt against her shoulder, the rhythmic cadence of her own slow breathing, these were the constants in her isolated world. It was just after noon when she saw it. She was observing the eastern ridge, specifically the area around the faint trail she had identified in the briefing. Her attention was drawn by a flicker of movement. Through the shimmering heat haze, she made out the shape of a mountain goat, picking its way along the treacherous path. It was a common sight. But something was wrong. The goat moved with an unnatural cadence. It would take a few steps, then pause for too long, its head unnaturally still. It moved into the shadow of a rock outcropping and did not reappear for several minutes, far longer than any animal would graze in one spot. Elena kept her scope trained on the location, her body perfectly still, her mind racing. Was it paranoia? Was the heat and the solitude playing tricks on her eyes? The memory of the briefing room of Griggs's dismissive comment echoed in her mind. A trick of the light. She fought down the urge to dismiss it. Her instincts, honed by thousands of hours of observation, were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. She remembered the mission that haunted her, a time when she had seen a similarly small anomaly, a bird that flew from a bush in a way that suggested it had been startled by something unseen and had hesitated to report it. That hesitation had cost lives. Never again. Triton 1, this is Eagle Eye. Over, she whispered into her radio, her voice a low murmur. Thorne's voice crackled back almost immediately, clear and professional. Send it, Eagle Eye. I have a possible spotter. Eastern Ridge Grid reference 319er842. Vicinity of the unmarked trail. Disguised as local fauna. Movement is inconsistent. Over. There was a pause on the other end. Elena could picture Thorne and his men crouched behind rocks, now looking up at the ridge she had described. She could feel his skepticism even through the radio waves. "Eagle Eye, can you confirm hostile over?" Negative, Elena replied, her voice betraying no emotion. "I cannot confirm hostile. I can only confirm that the movement is unnatural. My assessment is that it is a scout." Over. Another pause, longer this time. Thorne was weighing her instinct against his intelligence reports. Finally, his voice returned. "Roger that, Eagle Eye. We are increasing vigilance on our eastern flank. Keep observing. Notify me of any change. Triton 1 out." Elena did not reply. She simply settled back behind her scope, her eye once again pressed to the cool rubber of the eyepiece. The goat had still not reappeared. Down in the valley, the men of Triton's squad were now a little less relaxed, their heads scanning the ridges with a newfound urgency. Up on her perch, Elena watched and waited, the certainty of the coming storm settling in her heart like a cold stone. For another hour, the only movement in the valley was the dance of heat and wind. The men of Triton's squad, heeding Elena's warning, remained on high alert, but the stillness was pervasive, lulling the senses. They were beginning to believe it had been a false alarm. It was in that moment of lowered guard that the world exploded. The IED was buried under the road precisely at the narrowest point of the pass. The detonation was a physical blow, a concussive wave of pressure that slammed into the men, stealing the air from their lungs. A column of fire, earth, and shattered asphalt erupted towards the sky. The sound was absolute, a deafening, world-ending roar that was felt in the teeth and bones before it was heard by the ears. The ground bucked like a living creature. Before the echoes of the blast had even begun to fade, the mountainside erupted in a storm of gunfire. From the very ridge Elena had been watching, and from a dozen other hidden positions, machine guns opened up their heavy, rhythmic hammering, tearing chunks out of the rocks where Triton's squad scrambled for cover. The distinct, terrifying whoosh of a rocket-propelled grenade followed, impacting near their position with a secondary explosion that rained razor-sharp shrapnel over them. The simple observation mission had become a kill box. "Contact east, contact north." Thorne yelled, his voice raw. "Return fire, get me a sit rep. Cortez, are you?" His words were drowned out by a fresh hail of bullets. He pressed himself flatter against the rock, grabbing for his radio handset. "All Triton elements, this is Triton 1, suppressing fire Delta formation, Eagle Eye. We have troops in the open, talk to me." He was met with a wall of harsh, grating static. The IED's electromagnetic pulse, or perhaps a piece of shrapnel, had fried their primary comms unit. He tried the squad channel. More static. They were blind and deaf. High above the chaos, Elena watched in cold horror as her worst fears unfolded with textbook precision. Through her scope, she could see it all. She saw the muzzle flashes from hidden nests. She saw the disciplined fire teams of the enemy pinning her squad down. She saw the puff of dust as a round impacted inches from Thorne's head. For a single paralyzing moment, the sheer scale of the ambush threatened to overwhelm her. The ghost of her past failure rose, whispering that this was happening again, that she was helpless to stop it. Then the training took over. The years of discipline, of learning to compartmentalize fear and function under unimaginable pressure, asserted control. The panic receded, replaced by an ice-cold clarity. The emotion vanished, leaving only the mathematics of the problem. Her squad was trapped. Comms were down. She was their only eyes, their only hope. Her perch, once a place of isolated observation, had just become the most important piece of ground in the entire valley. Her hands moved with practiced, urgent grace. She swung the rifle into position, the butt settling into the familiar groove of her shoulder. Her eye found the scope. The chaotic, terrifying battle below was instantly framed, brought into sharp focus. The world shrank to the circle of her lens. The time for watching was over. It was time to hunt. In the heart of the storm, Elena was the calm. The chaos below the shouts, the explosions, the staccato rhythm of automatic fire was filtered through her scope, reduced to a set of solvable problems. Her mind, a cold and efficient calculator, began the grim triage of the battlefield. Her first priority was a machine gun nest that had pinned down half of Triton Squad behind a miserable excuse for cover. The gunner was pouring a relentless stream of fire, forcing the men to keep their heads down, unable to move or effectively fight back. Elena tracked the muzzle flash. She adjusted her scope for the distance 750 meters. The wind was a steady cross breeze from the left. She held her breath, exhaled halfway, and the world became still. The trigger broke cleanly. The recoil was a familiar, solid punch to her shoulder. Through the scope, she saw the machine gunner slump over his weapon, his stream of fire ceasing abruptly. One problem solved. But for every problem she solved, two more appeared. The enemy was well trained, using classic shoot and move tactics. They never stayed in one position for long, firing a few rounds before darting to a new piece of cover. They were ghosts flitting between the rocks. Hitting them was like trying to shoot drops of rain in a storm. She fired again, aiming for a rifleman who was taking aim at Thorne's position. The round kicked up dust just behind him as he dropped back behind a boulder. A miss. She ejected the spent casing, the metallic click, a sharp sound of frustration. Every bullet was a choice. Every miss was a second lost, another chance for one of her men to die. The heat from the barrel began to create its own mirage, a small shimmer just in her line of sight. The sun beat down, reflecting off the brass of the spent cartridges scattered around her. Her heartbeat was a low, steady drum in her ears. She forced herself to slow down to scan the entire battlefield, not just the immediate threats. And that is when she saw him. He was higher up the ridge than the others, partially concealed by a weathered juniper tree. He was not firing. He carried a rifle, but it remained slung on his back. Instead, he was using a pair of binoculars, observing the flow of the battle, directing his fighters with crisp, efficient hand signals. He would point, and a burst of fire would erupt from that direction. He would make a gesture, and a fire team would reposition to a new flanking angle. He was the conductor of this orchestra of death. The others were merely the instruments. The tactical dilemma presented itself in her mind with cold, brutal clarity. She could continue to engage the individual shooters, a reactive game of whack-a-mole that she might eventually lose as her position was discovered or her ammunition ran out. Or she could go for the head of the snake. The commander was a much more difficult target. He was further away, over 1,000 meters, she estimated. He was using cover intelligently, only exposing himself for brief moments. But if she could take him out, the entire coordinated attack might collapse into chaos. It was a low-probability shot, but one with a high-impact reward. She watched him for another 30 seconds, her crosshairs hovering in his vicinity. He stepped out from behind the tree to signal a team with an RPG. That was it. He was not just a threat. He was the threat. Her decision was made. The grunts could wait. Elena shifted her body, angling the rifle slightly higher. The commander ducked back behind the tree. The hunt had changed. She was no longer just trying to save her team from the soldiers in front of them. She was aiming to take down the man who was trying to kill them all. The only problem was, he was a ghost, and she needed him to stand still just for a second. Down in the kill box, the world had devolved into a nightmare of noise, dust, and pain. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt cordite and the metallic tang of blood. For Triton Squad, every rock was a tombstone, every open space a death sentence. Elena's occasional precise shots from above were a godsend, silencing a machine gun here, a troublesome rifleman there, but it was not enough. The enemy had the numbers and the position. They were being bled dry. A high-velocity round ricocheted off the rock near Private Cortez's head, and a secondary fragment of stone and copper jacket sliced through the meat of his shoulder. He cried out a sharp, ragged sound of pain that cut through the din of battle and slumped back against the rock, his rifle clattering to the ground. "Man down," Griggs yelled, crawling toward him. "Cortez is hit." The injury sent a shock wave of urgency through the squad. A static defense was a losing game. A static defense with a wounded man was a death sentence. They had to move, but they were pinned. Thorne knew their position was about to be completely overrun. He pulled the pins on 2 smoke grenades and hurled them into the open ground in front of them. Thick gray smoke billowed out, providing a temporary, fragile screen. "Get him back to the wadi," Thorne ordered, laying down a burst of suppressing fire from his own rifle. Under the cover of smoke and a volley of desperate fire, Griggs and another soldier dragged the groaning Cortez back towards a shallow ravine that offered slightly better cover. But it was a temporary reprieve at best. The enemy knew they were there. They were simply tightening the noose. Thorne fumbled with his radio, switching through frequencies, hoping for a miracle. The main channels were still dead. He switched to a short-range secondary channel, one meant for intra-squad communication, hoping its lower power might somehow cut through the interference. "Eagle Eye, this is Triton. 1, do you read me? I repeat, does anyone on this net read me?" He shouted into the handset, his voice cracking with desperation and exhaustion. He was answered by static. He was about to throw the handset down in disgust when a voice cut through the noise, faint but clear. "To read you, Triton 1, send traffic. Over." Relief washed over Thorne so powerfully it almost brought him to his knees. It was Elena. "Eagle Eye, we are pinned down, grid 317840. Cortez is wounded. We are taking heavy, effective fire from multiple positions. We cannot move." He paused, taking a ragged breath, the smoke stinging his eyes. He looked at his men huddled and bleeding. The professional calm was gone from his voice, replaced by a raw plea. "Elena, we need a miracle." High on her perch, Elena listened to his words. She heard the explosions and gunfire crackling behind his voice. She heard the desperation of a good man watching his soldiers die. The weight of his words, of that single word, miracle, settled on her. It was no longer a tactical problem. It was a promise she now had to keep. There was no room for miscalculation, no room for a gust of wind, no room for the ghost of past failures. There was only the target and the path her bullet had to fly. "Solid copy, Triton 1, she replied, her own voice an island of calm in his sea of chaos. "Stay in cover, be ready to move on my signal. Eagle Eye out." She looked back through her scope. The commander was still there, a phantom behind his tree. The miracle Thorne needed was over a kilometer away, hiding in the shadows. Time seemed to warp and stretch from Elena's perspective. The frantic, compressed seconds of the firefight below slowed to a thick, syrupy crawl. Her world narrowed to a series of numbers and observations. The mission, the men, the danger, all of it faded into the background, replaced by a singular, all-consuming physics problem. Her laser rangefinder gave her the first number 1,420 meters, an absurd distance. At that range, the bullet would be in the air for several seconds. It would drop dozens of feet. The spin of the Earth, the temperature, the humidity, even the slight downward angle from her position, every variable mattered. She held her kestrel wind meter up. It gave her the wind speed at her location 7 meters per second, gusting to 9, almost a direct crosswind. But the wind here was not the wind in the middle of the valley, nor the wind on the far ridge. She lowered the kestrel and trusted her eyes, watching the way the heat mirage flowed over the rocks, the direction a plume of dust was blowing 1,000 meters out. She saw 3 different wind patterns between herself and the target. She was not just shooting at a man, she was trying to thread a needle through a hurricane. Her fingers, steady and sure, dialed the adjustments into her scope's elevation and windage turrets. The clicks were tiny, precise sounds in the vast, quiet landscape. Click, click, click. Each one a quiet prayer based on a complex calculation of science and educated guesswork. The face of the man she had failed to save on that other mountain, in that other lifetime, flashed in her mind's eye. A moment of hesitation, a misread of the wind, a ghost. She closed her eyes for a single deliberate second. She would not let that ghost pull the trigger for her this time. When she opened them, the memory was gone, banished. There was only the here and now. The cool, smooth pressure of the rifle's cheek rest against her skin. The distorted, shimmering image in her scope. The absolute silence she built for herself in the center of the storm. And then it happened. The commander, perhaps growing impatient or needing a clearer view of the stalled assault, stepped boldly out from behind the juniper tree. He raised his binoculars to his eyes, scanning the trapped soldiers of Triton's squad. He was completely exposed. It was the mistake she had been waiting for. But it was a window that would not stay open for long. 5 seconds. Maybe 6. There was no more time for calculation, no more time for doubt. Her training and her instinct had brought her to this exact point. The numbers were set. The rifle was ready. She let out a long, slow breath, emptying her lungs. She settled the crosshairs, the delicate black lines of the reticle on the man's center mass. She did not think of him as a man. He was a target, a solution, a coordinate. In the space between heartbeats, when her body was at its most still, her finger began its final steady pressure on the trigger. Her breath was the only thing that existed. The world compressed into a single point of pressure under her index finger. The carefully constructed silence in her mind was absolute. She was not on a mountain in Afghanistan. She was not a soldier. She was nothing but a set of eyes, a pair of lungs, and a finger connected to a trigger. The trigger broke. It was not a pull, but a clean, surprising snap, like a thin pane of glass shattering. The rifle erupted against her shoulder, a violent kinetic force that she absorbed with her entire body, becoming one with the recoil. The roar of the 338 Lapua Magnum round was a singular, authoritative crack that ripped through the valley, a sound so loud it momentarily erased all others. For a fraction of a second, her vision through the scope was a blur of violent motion. But her training held. She did not blink. She did not flinch. She rode the recoil and brought the crosshairs back on target, holding her follow-through. This was the longest part of the wait. The bullet was gone, a ghost on the wind, utterly beyond her control. For nearly 3 seconds it flew. She could trace its faint vapor trail, a shimmering distortion in the air, watching it bend and curve as it fought the crosswinds she had tried to tame. 3 seconds for a miracle or for failure. 3 seconds that held the lives of 10 men. Through the powerful magnification, the scene was surreal, almost sterile. There was no sound of impact, no cinematic effect. There was only a small, dark blossom appearing on the commander's chest. His binoculars fell from his hands. He took a single stumbling step backward, his expression one of pure terminal surprise. Then he collapsed, disappearing from her view behind the rocks. Hit. Elena worked the bolt on her rifle with fluid automatic grace. The action was a single, smooth motion back then forward. The spent brass casing, hot to the touch, flew from the chamber and landed on the rock beside her with a single, sharp tink. The sound, so small and insignificant, was the only punctuation to the deafening silence that had suddenly fallen over the battlefield. For a moment, it seemed as if everyone, friend and foe alike, had stopped to process what had just happened. The relentless chatter of enemy rifles faltered. The invisible hand that had been guiding the assault was gone, and in its place was a vacuum of confusion. A wave of relief so profound it left her lightheaded, washed over Elena. Her lungs, which she had not realized she was holding, burned for air. She took a deep, shuddering breath, but there was no time for relief. The job was not done. She forced the emotion down, locking it away. Her eye returned to the scope, her senses on high alert, scanning for the next threat, the next target. The enemy was confused but not gone. The storm had broken, but the rain had yet to stop. The stunned silence in the valley lasted only a few seconds, but for Lieutenant Thorne, it was enough. He had seen enough battles to recognize a decapitation strike and the paralysis that followed. This was their chance. This was the miracle he had asked for. "On your feet!" He roared, his voice cutting through the ringing in his men's ears. Suppressive fire on the east ridge, Griggs cover Cortez. We are moving to that ravine. Now go, go, go. Adrenaline surged through the squad, washing away the fatigue and fear. They rose as one, a wave of disciplined violence. The sound of their rifles, which moments before had been a desperate, sporadic defense, now became a confident, overwhelming roar. They were no longer the hunted. They were the hunters. They poured a disciplined wall of lead toward the enemy positions, forcing the now leaderless fighters to keep their heads down. Under the cover of this renewed assault, Griggs and another soldier carefully moved the wounded Cortez, dragging him across the exposed ground and into the relative safety of the deeper ravine. The rest of the squad followed, moving in short, controlled bounds, covering one another. High above, Elena watched the tide turn. Her job had shifted. She was no longer focused on a single target, but on managing the entire battlefield. She scanned the enemy positions, looking for signs of a rally. She saw one fighter who seemed to be shouting orders, trying to organize a defense. She adjusted her aim, fired, and the new threat was neutralized. A few moments later, an RPG gunner began to set up his weapon for a shot at the ravine. Before he could aim, a round from Elena's rifle sent him tumbling down the rocks. She felt no triumph, no elation. This was cold, methodical work. It was the process of ensuring that the opening she had created remained open. Her focus was absolute, her emotions locked away. The only thing that mattered was the safety of the men below. Each shot was a confirmation of her promise to Thorne, another stone in the wall she was building around his team. Down below, the remaining enemy fighters felt the change. Their commander was gone. Their new leaders were being picked off by an unseen godlike force from the mountains. The sporadic fire from the trapped soldiers had turned into a disciplined and ferocious assault. Their numerical advantage had evaporated, replaced by terror and confusion. The will to fight broke. It started with one or two fighters scrambling from their positions and fleeing back up the mountain passes. Then a few more. Within minutes, it was a full-blown rout. They abandoned their heavy weapons and ran for their lives, their disorganized retreat a stark contrast to their coordinated attack just a short time before. Thorne watched them flee. He did not order a pursuit. Their mission was not to destroy the enemy, but to survive. He watched until the last running figure disappeared over the ridge. The sound of gunfire died away, replaced by the howling of the wind and the pained gasps of Private Cortez. The air smelled of victory, but also of smoke and blood. The ambush was over. They had survived. The silence that followed the battle was heavy and unnerving. Victory did not feel triumphant. It felt like survival. Thorne patched up Cortez as best he could, while the rest of the squad redistributed ammunition and took stock of their situation. They were alive, but they were deep in hostile territory, and the clock was ticking. "Ize is 2 clicks south," Thorne announced, his voice low and raspy. "We move now. Griggs, you have point. I want 360 security at all times." They ran, but they might have friends. Their journey to the extraction zone was a slow, grueling march. The terrain that they had navigated carefully in the dark was now a sun-baked obstacle course of sharp rocks and steep inclines. Carrying Cortez on a makeshift stretcher slowed them to a crawl. Every man was on edge, their heads on a constant swivel, scanning the silent, watching ridges around them. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion and the raw, frayed nerves of men who had walked to the edge of death and back. Elena did not join them. Her role was not finished. She remained high above a guardian angel with a rifle. As Triton's squad moved, she moved with them, leapfrogging from one overwatch position to the next. She was their eyes scanning the terrain far ahead and far behind, ensuring no pursuers were closing in. The weight of her pack felt immense, and a profound weariness had begun to settle into her bones. But her focus remained unbroken. Her duty was not done until they were all safe. An hour into their trek, a new sound began to filter through the wind. It was faint at first, a distant rhythmic chopping that was more felt than heard. Then it grew louder, more distinct, the unmistakable whump, whump, whump of a UH-60 Blackhawk's rotor blades cutting through the thin mountain air. For the men on the ground, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. A collective sigh of relief passed through the squad. They picked up their pace, their steps lighter with the promise of salvation. The helicopter appeared over the southern ridge, a dark, powerful shape against the pale blue sky. It circled the designated extraction zone, once scanning for threats, before descending in a controlled, violent whirlwind of dust and rotor wash. The ramp was already down as the skids touched the earth. Thorne and his men scrambled aboard the crew chief, helping them lift Cortez's stretcher inside. They piled in, collapsing onto the metal floor, the noise of the engines a deafening roar. As the last man got on, Thorne looked back up toward the high ridges, toward the unseen spot where he knew Elena was watching. He keyed his radio one last time. "Eagle Eye, the package is secure. We are lifting off. Solid copy, Triton." 1. Elena's voice came back as calm as ever. From her perch, she watched the Black Hawk rise, a storm of dust marking its departure. She stayed perfectly still, her rifle trained on the surrounding area until the helicopter was a shrinking speck in the sky. Only then, when they were truly gone, did the immense weight of the last few hours finally descend upon her. The tension drained away, leaving an exhaustion so profound it was a physical pain. She carefully began to disassemble her rifle, her movements slow and deliberate. Her watch was over. 24 hours later, the blood and dust of the Tarmac Valley felt a world away. Triton squad showered and in clean uniforms sat in the same cold, fluorescent-lit briefing room where their ordeal had begun. They were quieter now. The easy confidence from before the mission had been replaced by a sober, weary respect for the mountains beyond the wire. Private Cortez was absent, recovering in the medical bay. Elena stood in the back of the room near the door, her arms crossed. She was, as always, an island of stillness. At the front, Lieutenant Thorne delivered the after-action report to Major Davies, the base operations commander. His voice was a flat monotone reciting the facts of the engagement as required by protocol. He detailed the insertion, the ambush, the enemy strength, and their tactics. His report was precise, clinical, and stripped of all emotion. At 13:05 hours, Thorne continued, his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall. Triton's squad was effectively suppressed, and communications were compromised. The enemy commander was orchestrating the attack from a fortified overwatch position. He paused, taking a breath. At that point, our overwatch sniper element engaged and neutralized the enemy commander at an approximate distance of 1,400 meters. This action broke the enemy's command and control, allowing Triton to regain the initiative and break contact. The major, a stern man with tired eyes, looked down at the report summary in his hand. He nodded slowly. "One shot." "That is correct," Sir Thorne said. "One shot." Major Davies looked up, not at Thorne, but at the squad in general. "That is one hell of a shot. Commendations to that soldier. Their action undoubtedly saved the lives of this entire team. Make sure that is noted in the final submission, Lieutenant." And then he turned the page. Now regarding the compromised convoy schedule and the need for new route assessments. The conversation moved on to logistics, to the larger strategic implications of the failed ambush. The extraordinary moment, the miracle shot that had saved them all, was condensed into a single line in a report, its author a nameless, genderless element. The system by its very nature absorbed the incredible and filed it away as data. Elena listened from the back of the room. She felt the eyes of some of her squad mates drift towards her for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement, before snapping back to the front. She had expected to feel something, a flicker of anger, a sense of injustice. But there was nothing. Instead, a strange and profound sense of peace settled over her. The name in the report did not matter. The medal she would not receive did not matter. What mattered was the quiet breathing of the men in the room, the fact that they were here to be debriefed instead of being names on a memorial wall. That was her commendation. That was the only one she needed. "Dismissed," the major finally said. The men scraped their chairs back and filed out, their exhaustion palpable. The mission was officially over. In the days that followed, something shifted within Triton's squad. It was not a grand dramatic change, but a series of small, quiet alterations in the atmosphere. The men of Triton were not poets or orators. They were soldiers, and they spoke a language of action, not words. They never spoke of the shot. They never mentioned the commander on the ridge or the miracle that had saved them. But their respect, once a professional acknowledgement of her skill, had deepened into something more profound. Elena still sat in her corner of the barracks cleaning her rifle, but she was no longer an island. Sergeant Griggs, the man who had dismissed her concerns in the briefing room, walked by and placed a steaming cup of real coffee, not the instant sludge from the mess hall, on the mat beside her. He said nothing, just nodded once, and walked away. Later, another soldier, a young private, silently offered her a chocolate bar from a newly arrived package from home. She accepted these small tributes with a quiet nod of her own, unsure at first how to navigate this new, unspoken territory. The distance she had so carefully cultivated was being gently dismantled, not by grand gestures, but by quiet offerings of coffee and chocolate. The true turning point came 3 days after the mission. She was in the communal area reading a worn paperback when Private Cortez approached her. His arm was in a sling, his face still pale, but his eyes were clear. He stood before her, shifting his weight awkwardly, as if struggling to find words that did not exist. He did not try to speak. Instead, he reached into his pocket with his good hand and pulled out a small, circular patch. It was his unit's morale patch, a stylized trident, with the squad's motto embroidered underneath. It was not official issue. It was a symbol of identity, of belonging. A piece of the team's soul. He held it out to her. Elena looked from the patch to his face. She saw no pity in his eyes, only a deep, profound, and humbling gratitude. She slowly reached out and took it from him. The rough, embroidered texture was a solid, real thing in her palm. It felt heavier than it should. Cortez nodded once, a gesture that said everything he could not, and then he walked away, leaving her holding the small token. Elena looked down at the patch in her hand. This small circle of fabric was more valuable than any medal, more meaningful than any line in a report. It was an acceptance. It was a thank you. It was a statement that she was one of them, not an outsider, not just the Overwatch element, but a member of the family. For the first time in a very long time, the icy wall she had built around her heart began to feel the warmth of the sun. She carefully slipped the patch into her pocket, the weight of it a comforting presence. A few nights later, Thorn found Elena outside the barracks, looking out past the perimeter fence towards the dark, hulking shapes of the mountains. The desert air was cool and clean, and a brilliant canopy of stars glittered in the moonless sky. For a few moments he stood beside her in a comfortable silence, following her gaze. "They look different from out here, don't they?" he said finally. "Peaceful." Elena did not turn. "They are never peaceful, sir. Just quiet." Thorn nodded, accepting the correction. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a printed copy of the final submitted after-action report. He held it out to her. "I wanted you to see this," he said. "The official record." She took it, but did not unfold it. She already knew what it would say and what it would not say. Her name would not be in it. "Are you all right with it?" Thorn asked, his voice quiet, serious. It was not the question of an officer to a subordinate. It was the question of one human being to another. He was giving her a chance to voice any resentment, any feeling of injustice. He was acknowledging the gap between what was written and what was true. Elena looked from the paper in her hand to the distant mountains. She thought of the men sleeping in the barracks of Cortez, joking with the medics of the sound of their breathing in the debriefing room. She thought of the small embroidered patch in her pocket. "The report says we sustained 1 wounded and had 0 casualties," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It says we all came home, sir." She folded the paper neatly and handed it back to him. "That is the only report that counts." In that moment, Thorn understood. He saw the quiet strength, the profound dignity that defined her. Her reward was not fame or recognition. It was the lives of the people she served with. She fought for the outcome, not the credit. He felt a sense of humility, of deep and profound respect. The ghost that had haunted her, the ghost he had only sensed but never understood, seemed to finally be at peace. She had not erased her past, but she had redeemed it. He took the paper and tucked it away. The official record felt flimsy and unimportant compared to the truth that stood before him. "I doubted you, Elena." He admitted the words, costing him a piece of his pride, but granting him a measure of integrity. In the briefing room. "I heard your warning, but I did not listen. I will not make that mistake again." He met her gaze, his own eyes unwavering. "I will never doubt you again." It was a promise. In their world, it was the highest honor he could give. Elena gave a single small nod. Nothing more needed to be said. A bond of absolute unspoken trust had been forged between them in the cool desert air under the silent, watchful stars. The morning sun cast long, warm shafts of light into the barracks, illuminating dancing dust motes in the air. The familiar symphony of the bass was already in full swing, the distant roar of a cargo plane, the shouts of men on the training field, the low hum of the ever-present generators. It was a perfectly ordinary day. In her corner, Sergeant Elena Rostova sat on her cot. Spread before her on the olive-drab mat was her M2010 sniper rifle disassembled into its core components. The ritual was the same as it had been a lifetime ago before the mission to Sentinel Pass. The scent of gun oil was the same. The cool, solid feel of the steel parts in her hands was the same. But the woman performing the ritual had been remade. Her movements were still precise, deliberate, and economical. But the obsessive tension was gone from her shoulders. The haunted, anxious energy that had once driven her quest for perfection had been replaced by a quiet, settled calm. She was no longer trying to control a chaotic universe through the meticulous care of her weapon. She was simply tending to a trusted partner, a tool that had answered when called upon. The act was no longer one of fear, but of respect. She finished her work, assembling the rifle with a final satisfying click. She did not put it away immediately. Instead, she sat there, her hands resting on the cool stock, and looked out the small, dusty window of the barracks. Her gaze traveled past the perimeter fence, past the rolling desert foothills, to the jagged blue-gray peaks of the distant mountains. The same mountains that had almost claimed her team. The same mountains where she had found her redemption. A faint smile so slight it was almost imperceptible touched the corners of her lips. The ghost was gone. The burden she had carried for so long had been set down, left somewhere among those high, lonely rocks. She did not need a medal pinned to her chest or her name mentioned in a briefing. She did not need the world to know her story. The quiet nod from Griggs over a cup of coffee, the weight of Cortez's patch in her pocket, and the unwavering trust in her lieutenant's eyes, that was her parade. That was her monument. The official story would remain on file. He was just one sniper. A simple anonymous line in the vast history of the war. Let them have it. She and the men of Triton's squad knew the truth. She was Eagle Eye, a silent guardian, a hero who needed no applause, and she was at peace. In the official archives of the multinational task force Operation Sentinel Pass is recorded as a success. The after-action report details a failed ambush halted by an unidentified Overwatch sniper who took a shot that far exceeded conventional combat parameters. No name, no unit, no medal was recommended. The story of that shot became a whispered legend, a ghost story told between soldiers in distant outposts, about an unseen shooter who turned the tide with a single bullet. They always used the pronoun he, but for the soldiers of Triton Squad, the truth lived in a space more sacred than any report. They never spoke of the details of that day, but the silent acknowledgement became a part of their unspoken creed. It existed in the respectful nod in the shared silence around a fire, and in the unofficial motto they added to their unit's flag sub oculo aquilis, under the eagle's eye. Lieutenant Marcus Thorne went on to command, forged by a lesson no military academy could ever teach. He learned to trust the quiet ones and to listen to the warnings that are never spoken aloud. Private Cortez made a full recovery, with only a scar on his shoulder as a reminder. He never learned the sniper's name, but on long desert nights, he would often look up at the mountain peaks and think of the guardian angel who had watched over him from a distance. And Sergeant Elena Rostova, she continued to serve still in the shadows, an unseen guardian. Her rifle remained her faithful companion, but it was no longer a shield against the past, but a tool of the present. The ghosts in her mind were quiet now, replaced by the memory of 10 soldiers who had returned home safely. Because heroes are not defined by the medals they wear, but by the lives they save. And in the quiet corners of the world, where history is written in deeds, not words, she was more than enough.